Hi, in this video I'm going to show you my process for painting this puppy with the flag. The first thing I of course did was sketched it out, and I applied masking fluid to the areas that I wanted to remain white. Then I mixed up a dark brown and sort of a reddish brown and started painting the eyes. I tried to pay attention to where the highlights are and where the color changes and let those just blend in together. I used my number 2 brush, and where the paint got a little thick, I just dabbed it out with some paper towel. And then I did the second eye the same way. Now keep in mind, this is just the first layer of paint. There'll be more layers of paint on the eyes as I go, but I'm just kind of establishing the basic lights and darks and where I want my highlights and shapes inside of the eyes. And once I get the first layer, the first colors in, I'm just going to let it dry and go on to another part of the puppy. So as those are drying, I went ahead, and since this is a brindle puppy, I started out adding some of a reddish brown, kind of a reddish brown yellow color, nice earth tone, wherever I could see the little brindle, the stripes peeking out from the darker color. So I went ahead and applied those first, and I just paid attention to the shapes that they were and the placement, so that I could later come back. I'm going to come back with a dark mixture and start to paint tiny little hairs, little dashes, little lines. I'm making sure that I go in the same direction that the fur is growing so that it'll look more realistic. Now this is also just my first layer, and this is a mixture actually of blue and brown. It's not black. I don't use black very often in my watercolors. I always use a mixture to get a dark color like this, and this one just happens to be a blue and a brown, a dark brown. And I'm just going to start putting in where the darkest shapes are, just doing those little tiny hash marks, painting it right over the brown marks so that I'll get that brindle look at the end. Also, I am darkening up some of the areas in the eyes, especially the pupil, and adding the shadow. Every eyeball has a shadow over the lid if you're a mammal. Let's put it that way. So we're just putting a little bit shadow from the lid. The eyeball has a shadow cast on it from the lid. Then I'm just adding a little bit more of the black spots, going ahead, making sure I go into that brown right over it. Now where I want the black color, which we know is not a true black, where I want it darker, I'm going ahead and I'm putting those hash marks closer and laying them on top of each other as we go, just so that I'll get those areas a little darker. Of course, where I want it lighter, I let the hash marks be further apart, and I also dilute them with just a little bit of water so that they look a little more gray. And I'm just going to continue on his little face, putting those shapes and shadows in, making sure that I get it where I want it the darkest, and paying attention also to where the light areas are. I'm also trying to pay attention to where any of the little wrinkles are or his little eyebrows are as I go, so that I'll get those correct. Now I'm going to come back in here and add a little bit more details to his eyes, darken them up just a little bit. And this next eye too, if you can see, I have removed the masking fluid so I can do the eyeliner on him. That's what it looks like to me. Sometimes dogs look like they have eyeliner. So I'm putting in his eyeliner. I'm also making sure his highlights are still in his eyes. As that dries, I'm going to come back and keep darkening up the areas. I'm going to keep painting over that light brown, that kind of orangey brown color, because we're going to try to achieve that brindle look, because the puppy is a brindle puppy. Brindle dogs are my favorite dogs of all time, that coat color. And we're going to just go ahead, keep adding in the shadows where you see them, making sure it's darker where you want it. And I'm just going to scrub his highlight out of his eye just a little bit. It looked a little too dark for me, so I'm just going in there with a bristle brush and clear water and just scrubbing up and lifting some of that paint. As I go and as the painting develops a little bit more, I can see where things need to be lighter or darker. So I always want to evaluate at different stages, does something need to be lighter or darker? And that's what I had done for those eyes, and I decided that they probably needed a little bit more highlight. So now I'm going to continue working with the dark color, that mixture around his little eyes. I'm making sure that where the creases are and the wrinkles are, that I get that part, the little shadows right there, the darkest. And I'm just going to continue building those stripes up, painting right over the brown. And don't worry, we're not going to leave these harsh, because they look a little harsh, these lines. Before it's all over with, I'm going to show you how to soften and blend those in. But for right now, we're going to let them stand out and look a little bit harsh, a little bit hard. That's fine. So if you feel like your lines are very distinct, it's okay. We're going to fix that before the end of the painting. And here I've decided I needed to add a little bit more of the brown in some of the areas. So I'm just coming back in. I'm using a very small number 2 brush, and I'm adding some of the brown into the areas right over the black tick lines that we've made. I'm calling them tick lines, the little hair lines, the little brush strokes. I'll mix up a little bit more of that dark color, and we're just going to continue working around his head. Now in some of the areas that need to be darkened up, I'm just going to come back in and darken it up. Again, we're painting right over those brown. But now we're not completely covering up the brown stripes. We're just putting a few little hairlines over it. And in some spots, I'm adding a little bit more of a reddish brown, and also doing little tick marks over the lighter brown. And I'm just looking at my reference photo and trying to decide where these colors need to be. And then I'm coming back in with my dark and adding that in, all the while just making those tiny little lines that look like hairs, remembering to keep the hairs growing in the same direction. And what I mean by that is I'm just making sure my brush strokes are going in the same direction, that the hair is actually growing on the puppy, so that he'll look a little bit more realistic and he'll look like you want to just pet him. So we're just going to keep doing that and paying attention to his little nose wrinkles. This is a little bulldog puppy. And we're going to put the shadows in around his little wrinkles across his nose. That's actually called a nose rope. English bulldogs have a little wrinkle over their nose, and it is called a nose rope. Some are a little bit more distinct than others. This one doesn't have as big of a nose rope as some bulldogs do. So now it's just making his nostrils, filling in his nostrils with some of the darker color, then coming back to the wrinkle above his nose and starting to shade that in, just using tiny tick marks, tiny little hash marks, again in the direction that the fur is growing on the puppy, so it'll look realistic. I'm going to add a little bit more over the brown. Painting animals is not difficult, but it does take some patience if you do it the way that I do it, which is I like to make the little tiny marks as I go. Some people do it by painting in just the shapes and the shadows, but I actually like the look of the fur, so I take my time and do the little tick marks. So now I've got his nose painted in with sort of a pale brownish gray, and then right on his upper lip and a little bit down on his bottom lip, I've taken a little bit of brown and a little bit of red paint and mixed it together to get this sort of browny pinky color. That is his lip color. And I've just painted that in, painted the shape of it in. And I'm going to go ahead and make those little tiny dots going through around his nose to get the texture. If you'll look at most dogs' nose, they have sort of a bumpy texture. So I'm just doing tiny little stippling marks. Again, where I want it darker, I'm making the little tiny dots closer together. Where I want it lighter, I'm spacing them further apart. And work on his eyes just a little bit more, adding a few more shadows in there. A little bit more color while his nose and his lip dries. And just going to keep coming up here to his little ear now. And get his ear painted. Same method. And the paint is fairly thick actually. The paint is probably the thickness of cream. It's not a real watery paint because I want it to stay where I put it. And I also want it to sit more on top of the paper because later we're going to take a clear water and soften this whole puppy up so that all of those individual little lines won't be showing. They won't be so obvious. You'll still get the feeling of fur and texture, but it just won't be as obvious. So I'm just adding some more reddish brown in here into some of the spots that I see on the ear and down the side of his neck here, along underneath his little chin. We're just going to add some more of the brown and then come back in with the darker mixture of the black. We're calling it black, it's not black, the darker mixture. And we're going to start painting that ear. And it might be a little tiny bit tricky because it has just a little bit of a change in the direction that the fur grows as it comes around the ear. So just be mindful of that. I don't know if you just heard my dog take a big sigh, but he's right here beside of me as I'm recording this, and he is less than enthused about it. I'd say he's pretty bored with the painting already. And I want to encourage you to really look at any reference photo that you're painting from, and the main thing you want to notice and really take note of is where the lights and the darks are, because that's what's going to shape your actual painting and make it look more three-dimensional. If you get those lights and darks, those shadows and highlights correct, if you get them in the right spot and in the right shape and the right value. You want them to be as dark where they need to be, mid-tones where those need to be, and the highlights where they need to be. Now here I just put some clear water over it, and then I just dabbed it with my cotton swab to lighten that area up because I had it a little bit too dark. So now we're just going to come under his chin. We're going to add a little bit more around the wrinkle on his little bottom lip, or I guess that's his upper lip. And notice I'm not painting a straight line. I'm doing tiny little dots around his lip and around his eye. That's because if I did a straight, solid line, it would not look realistic. It would look static and kind of blah. So when I paint my little lines, I don't make them solid lines. I do tiny little dashes, sort of a little jiggity jaggedy motion, as you see right here. I'm showing you right here, just a little jiggity jaggedy, and shadow under that upper lip. And now I'm going to add some of the little wrinkles to his little muzzle, his little snout, and I'm blending some of those out with just clear water, putting the shadow under his little chin. Going to go ahead and add some more of the dark mixture for fur where it's starting to come up on his little chin. And now we're going to work on the other side of his snout and get those little sort of wrinkles in. And just remember, where it wants to be darker, you just put your strokes a lot closer together. And sometimes you can just keep putting strokes on top of strokes if you wanted a really dark spot. Now this is one of the cutest puppies, but he looks so sad. I'm going to do underneath his chin and get that in there. He has a little white spot on his chest, so being very careful to avoid that. And he's got plenty of little wrinkles underneath his chin. I'm adding a little bit more brown now, coming down onto his shoulders. Making sure that I avoid that white spot. I don't want to paint over it by mistake. He has a little white spot on his chest. Adding a little bit of the darker color, and then I just blended that out with some clear water. Now I'm just taking a brush loaded with clear water, and I'm going over the whole face of the puppy. And you see how it starts to just soften that up and really blend it together. And the fur doesn't look as harsh. It looks smoother, more petable, I guess you could say. So this is just clear water, and before you do this though, make sure the puppy's face and head is completely dry before that you take a brush of clear water and go over it and smooth it and blend it. So now I'm back to his little snout, his little muzzle again. I'm going ahead, adding more detail, more shadow. Paying attention to his wrinkles and how they have little shadows and highlights on them. And I'm just taking clear water and blending that out with my brush. And adding a little bit of shadow to his upper lip and the bottom lip, using a little bit of that red brown. I'm going to continue on his chest here. And he's really starting to look cute. Very, very cute. I'm just getting those tick marks in and avoiding that white spot on his chest, because I want it to stay as light as possible. So I'm being really careful with it. I'm coming under his chin, getting the shadows in under the little wrinkle under his chin and under his top lip here. I'm going to come in with my darker paint right over that brown, putting in the little tick marks for the hair, the little hash marks. And I'm trying to pay attention to where the stripes are on the puppy and getting those in there the way that they should be. Adding a little bit more brown to the areas where it needs it. Now I'm just taking the white spot on his chest, and I just took some clear water and ran over it, and that made the water pick up a little bit of that black mixture and turn it to gray. I didn't have to do any kind of paint. I just took clear water and ran it over that white area, and some of it touched the black, so it pulled it down into the white area. So now I am just wetting the blue part of the flag, and I'm going to take a nice rich blue while it's still wet. This is wet on wet, and just put where the shadows are. That's where I'm putting the concentration of my blue and letting the water blend it and do the work for me. I'm paying attention to where the shadows are, so we're going to leave those fairly light. We're not going to paint we're not going to put the pigment straight into the light areas. We're just going to put the pigment into where the areas are dark and into the shadows. And just let it blend its own self together. Now I'm putting in the red stripes of the flag, or a red stripe. This flag doesn't show a lot. So I wet it, then I put in the red, and then I put in a darker, a little bit more pigment where the shadows were. So now I'm just taking a pale wash of blue and painting that over the area of blue I just painted. It was dry, by the way. Make sure you dry it first. Now I'm going to add some more detail shadow work on his upper lip, using a little bit darker version of the red and brown mixture, and blending that into his wrinkles. Making sure I get the shadows in there right. I'm going to work on these big old puppy paws of his. Just like I did the face, I'm going to start off by laying down an underpainting of the brown where the brown is supposed to be. And making sure that I leave the tips of his paws white, because he has white boots on. That's what I like to say when dogs have white paws. They've got their little boots on or their little socks on. Coming back in with the dark mixture and putting that in the stripes where the stripes are, making sure that I overlap it and come into the brown some so that it looks like fur and it's not just irregular spots of paint. And I'm just going to come, he's got some spots on his white toes, so I'm going to go ahead and put those in. And take a really, really pale mixture of the black mixture we've got. Just added a lot of water to it and separate his toes, make the shadows on his toes. And I'm going to take that same pinky brown and do his little toenails as well. Just taking clear water and going over that, but I'm dabbing some of it up so that the brown will come back through. And some shadows on his toenails. Then we're going to do the same thing to his other paw. Put in the black right over the brown. Make sure that the brown is dry first though, so we don't want it to bleed. Making sure I get those stripes in there just like I did the other paw. Painting right over the brown with the dark mixture. Making sure that the fur is that the lines, my paint strokes, match the way that the fur is growing on his paw. Putting in some of the shadows to separate his little toes on his paw using that watery gray mixture. Adding his little toenails using the pinky brown that I used for his lips with just a little bit extra red added. Making sure I get those shadows in. Taking a little bit of gouache and just highlighted those little nails. Now I'm coming back in, adding a little bit of shadow work right along the edge. And you can see I've already taken off the masking fluid off of the stars. Just adding more shadows. And I'm just adding the little details in the stars with a little bit of that really watered down gray mixture. It's just the black that we used for the fur with a lot of water, really watery. And I'm putting in the shadows and the details to the stars. Almost complete, almost done. Just gonna have to add a shadow, add some stitch marks, and gonna have to add a shadow to the white stripe so that it looks a little more realistic. Darken up the shadows under the paws. And we will have ourselves a puppy painting in short notice. Just get that last little bit of a shadow in. And there you have it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.